All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you for attending today's presentation on advanced amendments. This webinar will be recorded, and the recording and PDF will be sent out to all attendees through that Google Drive link that's in the follow-up email. If there are any issues with audio, just feel free to ping me, write me in the chat. My name is Erica DeLello, and I'm project manager for NORESCO. This series is sponsored by the Colorado Energy Office with training materials created by NORESCO and Wakefield Group. We've been working with the Colorado Energy Office to provide trainings just like this one. And so here we have the list of trainings that are offered in this series over the next few months. As you can see, I'm very excited. We've added quite a few more webinars to the Wednesday webinar series. Kevin will actually be presenting on the IECC versus ASHRAE in April, so keep an eye out for that one. And so if you'd like to register for any of these, I'll be sending out an email with a link to register. So keep an eye out for that within the next week. In addition to these trainings, we've also put together a code adoption toolkit that reviews cost implications of changing code cycles, the benefits, benefits, and a lot of other compliance resources. There's also a troubleshooting guide on there that covers iCode conflicts, alignments, clarifications, and passive compliance. So both of these resources can be accessed through the Colorado Energy Office's website. And so throughout the webinar, we do want to encourage questions. So please use the Q&A function, and I'll let our presenters know at the end. The chat window can also be used to chat among participants. And then last, there is a ability to raise your hand, and at the end of the presentation, I can unmute you and you can ask the presenters directly. So there will be a survey window that pops up. If you could please take a minute to provide feedback so that we can continue to improve on these webinars. Today's presenters are Kevin Perry and Jim Dent. Kevin is a certified commissioning professional with a decade of experience. He's a certified plans examiner and inspector as well for IECC and ASHRAE. And Jim, he's the VP of pre-construction at Wakefield Group Contracting and has been managing electrical pre-construction for 47 years now. So he's a master electrician in Colorado and Wyoming, as well as being an electrical inspector. And both Jim and Kevin have separately provided over 100 trainings on IACC. So they are well-versed in the topic and are ready for any questions that you may have. So with that, I'll go ahead and stop sharing. And Kevin, if you would like to take it from here, go for it.
Great. Let me make sure I'll get the right screen share. And are you seeing the full presentation?
Looks good.
Okay, good. All right, thanks, Erica. And we'll get started. So today's presentation, we're going to be presenting on the Colorado local amendments. So throughout the state, they have adopted the IECC, the Energy Code, for different versions. And each jurisdiction has the ability to amend those documents. And so it can be really confusing, being that there's over 300 AHJs, authorities having jurisdictions, on how to follow what's what in each city or county. So today, that's what we're going to talk about. And Erica already mentioned who we are. And being that there's so many, there's over 300, Colorado's a home rule state, and there are over 300 AHJs, authorities having jurisdictions. It would be very hard for us to cover every single one of those in our presentation. So what we did for today on the agenda is we're going to review the top 3 largest AHJs that are the most commonly construction areas in Colorado. We're not favoring any one of these by any means, and we are not saying that any of the other AHJs are less important. It's just by sheer volume, these 3 AHJs do the most construction through Colorado, so it's a bigger audience for us to hit. So those 3 are going to be the City and County of Denver, the City and County of Boulder, and the City of Fort Collins. And we'll go in that order for the amendments. So a little background information, just like each authority having jurisdiction has different amendments, each of them can call them different things, which gets confusing, and each of them can adopt different years. So you'll see that Denver is called the 2019 Denver Building and Fire Code, and that is based on the 2018 IECC. Boulder calls theirs the 2020 City of Boulder Energy Conservation Code. And then Fort Collins calls theirs the International Energy Conservation Code of the City of Fort Collins. So all of these are based on the 2018 IECC, but have different names depending on which jurisdiction you're in. Denver adopted theirs in December of 2019. Boulder adopted theirs March of 2020. And then Fort Collins adopted theirs January of 2019. So let's jump right into it. We have a lot to cover. We'll start with the Denver amendments. Here are the items that we'll be covering in the Denver amendments: the pathways, definitions, envelope, energy options, lighting, solar, and EVs. And we're trying to cover just the bigger items that have been amended. So there are going to be some items that we skip over that are still important, but for the sake of time, we're going to try and cover just the largest impact ones. So pathways of compliance for Denver, you have the IECC. This is a little bit of what I was talking about. Then you have your AHJ, your authority having jurisdiction amendments. So you have the IECC over there on the right, which is what Denver has adopted. And then they have amendments to that, which allows you to follow ASHRAE 90.1. But something I like to point out on this screen is that Denver also has a green building ordinance, which talks about some solar or green space, energy conservation measures. And then they also have this Denver Green Code. And so I want to point out that the IECC is a requirement, which you could follow ASHRAE. Also, the Green Building Ordinance is a requirement. Sometimes those two conflict with each other, and we'll try to discuss those. But the Denver Green Code is an optional one. That's a stretch code for Denver. So you do not have to follow that unless you are going for the stretch code. So let's start with definitions. Denver has changed what an above grade wall definition is. Above grade walls and spandrels are now above grade walls and needed to be checked for insulation values on there. I won't get into that too much more, but this definition changes on a little bit of your modeling pathways if you're going down the modeling route on checking envelope requirements. Another thing that Denver has changed is the definition for group R2, which is multifamily. They now consider multifamily group R2 as commercial buildings. So no matter what size they are, they're now all considered to be commercial and must follow the commercial provisions. So we'll get into windows. I did a side-by-side comparison here for you to show you the Denver amendments according to how they compare to IECC or ASHRAE 90.1. You can follow either one of these pathways, IECC 2018 or ASHRAE 90.1 2016, according to the Denver amendments. However, there is a slight difference you'll see in red that these two items over here, entrance doors and all other vertical fenestrations, have a different value than both ASHRAE and IECC. So just keep that in mind. The comparison is based off of IECC, since that is what Denver has adopted. So these Denver values over here are off of the IECC columns. So don't be confused that this 0.45 doesn't match up with this 0.46 in ASHRAE. This 0.45 is being compared to the IECC column. The next item for Denver on amendments is this air barrier compliance options. So what Denver has done is said that they would like to follow the air barrier compliance option. The code says you need either materials or the assemblies to meet or a whole building test. So you need one of these two on the left side or have a whole building envelope test to comply with the code. Denver has amended that. What Denver says is you need to do one of these options on the left, materials or assemblies, and the whole building test, and envelope commissioning. So that's a little bit different than before, where you would do materials or assemblies or the whole building test. Denver amended that and said you have to do a little bit more than that. So for the envelope test, since this is new to Denver, it's important to talk about this, since you will have to be do testing, is that there is a standard to test by. And Denver says that you do your building envelope test, which is like a blower door test if you're familiar with that. And if you're below 0.40 CFM per square foot of envelope, you pass the Denver amendment. So you might be asking what happens if I'm over 0.40 CFM per square foot of envelope. Well, you still pass. However, Denver requires the testing agency to do a diagnostic evaluation, either using tracer smoke or infrared imaging, so thermography. And that's got to be done while the building is pressurized. Any areas of leakage from that diagnostic testing must be sealed, as long as you don't have to have any deconstruction of the existing building components that are already installed. And then an additional report identifying those corrective actions taken needs to be submitted to both the building owner and the code official. And then you would pass even though you're over the 0.4 CFM requirement that Denver has put in their amendments. So you might ask, how can I calculate that? Well, here's an example building for the sake of time. I'll let you do this on your own. However, if you want to do the math comes out to be about 83,600 square feet of envelope area. And remember, Denver allows you 0.4 CFM times that value, and that would be your allowable leakage for that building. So it's an easy calculation to do. You can do it in design to see how, which components you need to focus on being tight and connections need to be tight, and be prepared for your testing. So I mentioned that Denver also requires envelope commissioning as part of their amendment. And what that is defined as for Denver is that a construction document review needs to happen. Installation inspections need to happen. A log of items of deficiencies, if there are any, along with any corrective actions taken, and then a final report provided. So these items are what's defining Denver in their building envelope commissioning requirement. And then section 406 says that there are 8 options of additional energy efficiency options to be selected. The IECC says you have to pick one of these items. Denver has amended that and said that you have to pick two of these items. You can pick any two. So the two in red down here, sorry for the confusion, those are not the ones that Denver are requiring you to pick. You can pick any one, or sorry, any two of these 8, but the red items have been added since the last code cycle. So don't get that confused with the red being mandatory for Denver. You just have to pick 2 of these options. And if you're not familiar of what was added in the last code cycle, these little percentage values will give you a little hint. So remember, Denver had a 0.40 air infiltration requirement for testing. Well, if you want to pick that as an option, one of your 2 options, you have to have a better value. So it would be 0.25 CFM of envelope leakage. And then also on this enhanced envelope performance, if you want to pick that as your option, it would have to be 15% better than the code. All the other 6 items have not changed in terms of percentages that you have to have on code. So with that, I'll turn over to Jim Dent, who will cover the electrical amendments for Denver.
Thanks, Kevin. Good afternoon, everybody. So Denver added section C 405.2.7 parking garage lighting control. I saw one of the chats, people were wondering what's written into the 2021 code. The 2021 IECC does have parking garage lighting control in it. However, both Denver and Boulder, we'll see Boulder here in a few minutes. If you look at item number 2, lighting power of each luminaire shall be automatically reduced by not less than 60%. When there's been no activity detected within the lighting zone 20 minutes, lighting zone shall be no larger than 3,600 square feet. That requirement is common to both Denver and Boulder in terms of 20 minutes and 3,600 square feet and 60%. However, the 2021 IECC just requires a 30% reduction. And there are some exceptions to this just in terms of fenestration and if there's coverings on the fenestration and stuff like that. We don't really have time to go through the exceptions, but Denver and Boulder are both more stringent than the 2021 IECC. So I expect to see the amendment stay in both Denver and Boulder because they are more stringent. Fort Collins did not have a parking section in their amendments to the IECC. Next slide, Kev. Denver added section C 405.3.3 concerning lighting for plant growth and maintenance. Both Denver and Boulder have this amendment. You'll see this again in the Boulder slides. And for plants, lumens, or how much candle power, how light it is, isn't really what they want to measure. They want to measure the photosynthetic photon efficacy. So how many photons per second. So Denver and Boulder have both adopted a photon efficacy of not less than 1.6 micromoles per joule. Denver listed 3 ways to achieve that. Boulder did not list the 3 ways to achieve that, and Fort Collins did not address this in their amendments to the code. Next slide, Kevin.
Sure. I heard something the other day that I was confused about these moles per joules and lumens, and someone told me that remember, lumens are for humans.
So Denver's got solar readiness in as an appendix. It's appendix CA, and you see the 2 items that are asterisked here, the pathway for routing or conduit or piping from the zone to the panel. You have to account for that in Denver for solar readiness. And the panel must have reserved space for a dual pole circuit breaker. Interestingly enough, Denver does not require you to have busing capable of supporting both the utility feed and the photovoltaic feed. So when we built the research support facility back in 2008, 2009, we had a 4,000 amp feed coming from the utility and a 2,000 amp photovoltaic array on the roof. So we had to have a 6,000 amp switchgear. So that would be a very expensive custom switchgear. So the way we got around that was we built one section of switchgear at 6,000 amps, put a 4,000 amp breaker in it. And then we had downstream of that, we had 4,000 amp switchgear. So Denver's requiring breaker space, but they're not requiring you to account for upsizing the bus, which is, so it's a step in the right direction, but Denver's not quite all there. But Boulder is further along than Denver, and we'll see that when we get to their amendments. Next, Kevin. So Denver added section C 405.10, and you'll see Boulder's got a different C 405.10 and Fort Collins got a different C 405.10. So depending on which jurisdiction you're in, this number could mean different things, but Denver C 405.10 is their electric vehicle amendment. They've got three definitions. Electric vehicles ready is there's a 2-pole 40 amp circuit pulled to a parking space from a panel that's energized, ready to go. Electric vehicle capable is having an empty conduit from an electrical room to every parking space. Well, depending on commercial or residential. In residential, you've got to have in Denver, you've got to have a conduit to every parking space. In an office building, it's like 10%. And then 5% of the buildings have to be electric vehicle supply equipment installed, which is there actually has to be charging equipment installed. So you have to be knowledgeable about what the definition is, because the definition of electric vehicles ready in Boulder is different than electric vehicles ready in Denver. And that's something we'll address here in just a few minutes. Next slide, Kevin. So C405.10.1 is the residential table. And you'll notice that 10 or more spaces, 15% of the spaces have to have circuits pulled to them. They are EV ready. The remainder of the spaces have to be EV capable, and 5% of the spaces actually have to have charging equipment installed. And in all cases, when you do these calculations, you're required to round up in terms of the number of spaces. Table C405.10.2 is for office buildings. And you'll see office buildings, 10% of them have to be EV ready with circuits pulled to them. 10% have to be EV capable with empty conduits, but no panel or anything. And then 5% of the spaces have to have EV charging equipment installed. So we're going to talk in a minute about the costs, and the costs that we're going to talk about are strictly electrical costs. In Denver, if you're building a building, you will have to account for the space in the electrical room for any electrical equipment that might be required to support EV charging in the future. So even though you've got an empty conduit to every space in an apartment building, for example, you don't have to have a panel or switchgear or anything to support those empty conduits, but you do have to have space, and you do have to have infrastructure in terms of conduits underground to a future outdoor transformer pad site, for example. So Denver's trying to make it possible for easy installation of future future EV charging. So assume a group R occupancy with 450 parking spaces. What I did here was I took two Wayfield projects, two high-rise, both of which had around 450 parking spaces. And on each project, I took the cost of the switchgear and the cost of the feeders, and I added those two numbers together and divided it by the total amperage of the facility to come up with the cost per amp. So that's how I got to where we got in this calculation. So 208 volts times 40 amps is 8,320 watts per space. If you skip down to number 4, 20% of the spaces is 90 spaces. 90 spaces times 8,320 watts is 748,000 watts, divided by 208 times 1.732 is 2,000 amps. So you would have to round that up to a 2,500 amp service, and at $214 an amp, that comes out to $535,000. Next slide, Kevin. But that's just for the service. Now we're going to talk about the branch wiring. So 5% of 450 is 23 spaces rounded up. So using a charge point dual head charger, fully installed, it's about 12,000 bucks for us. So that's 12 of those at $12,000 each is 144,000. 15% of 450 is 68, rounded up again. 68 times $800, which is the cost to run a 100-foot 3/4-inch conduit with a 40-amp circuit in it, is 54,000. And then the remainder of the space is 359 would have to have an empty conduit, which is $280 for a 100-foot average, for around $100,000. So the total for the EV branch wiring and install is $298,000. So if you take the EV switchgear, $535,000, and the $298,000, you come up to $833,920. That doesn't include the infrastructure for future or the impact of the loss of square footage due to the future service. Next slide, Kev. So 833,920 divided by 450 is 1,800 bucks a space. And the cost per square foot for the facilities, both of them were around 550,000 square feet, is $1.53 a square foot. Those are a couple of metrics you can use when you're looking at projects for yourself. I ran the same calculation for a 247 space multifamily project and came up with $1,700 a space, so it was pretty close. And I used the average cost per amp and average for the square footage just to keep things simple. And then an office example would be around 80 cents a square foot because there are fewer stringent requirements for offices. Next slide, Kev. Jumping into the Boulder amendments.
So thanks, Jim. We'll dive into Boulder. So that wraps up Denver's big amendments. And you'll see on the screen the items that we'll cover for Boulder's big amendments. So the pathway of compliance for Boulder is a little bit different than what you might be used to in the IECC. For new build, they break it out into 3 categories, whether it's a new build, if it's a core and shell, or if it's existing building. With new builds, you have 2 pathways. It's performance or prescriptive, which is similar to what you're used to. However, it's based in Boulder on dollar, construction valuation dollar. So $500,000 construction valuation or less, you have to go the prescriptive route. If it's over $500,000, you have to follow the performance route. And their performance route is following ASHRAE Appendix G. So if you're familiar with Appendix G, it's referencing 2016's version of that. However, keep in mind, Boulder did amend that as well. So Boulder has it's called ASHRAE 90.1 2016 Appendix G, and Boulder has modified Appendix G protocol. That's what they call it, Boulder Modified Appendix G protocol. So if you're doing a core and shell project, a temporary certificate of occupancy or a TCO will be issued until the TI portion of that building shows that the energy efficiency measures that were counted for in the core and shell are in place for the TI portion. So you no longer can take credit for the TI portion of energy efficiencies until that has been modeled and shown that it's true. And then existing buildings, the 2 amendments that we would like to point out here are for additions and alterations. So existing building additions and alterations do have to do acceptance testing based on the BTU per hours of the mechanical systems and service hot water heating. So just know that that's a little bit different than the standard code. And again, the additions are based on the $500,000 valuation above of prescripted or performance on existing buildings. So if you're doing an alteration or addition that is more than $500,000, then you would have to do a performance pathway, which is Appendix G. Now we get into the R values of Boulder and what they've amended. So anything in red, I did a side-by-side comparison again for you. It's based on the 2018 because that's what they've adopted. So anything that Boulder has over here in their column, compare it to the 2018 column, and you'll see the differences that Boulder has created, amended, and it's quite a bit. So everything in red has been amended, and for the most part has increased for construction. The same thing for windows. So this is the exact same comparison, but for Boulder, and again, compared to the IECC, they actually have reduced the requirement for fixed fenestration, but increased it for entrance doors and all other vertical fenestration. And air leakage. So this is a requirement in the Boulder amendments that testing has to be done on the envelope, and it has to be done by a third party. When can testing be done? Well, it can be performed after completion of all penetrations. So we don't necessarily have to have the skin up to test the envelope in Boulder, but all the penetrations have to be completed. So that would be like window openings, windows have to be in place, the doors would have to be in place. Any mechanical vents or shafts would have to be in place. You know, if you have curbs for your HVAC, then those would have to be set and in place. So all the penetrations would have to be done, and then you can test. And what Boulder allows you to do, they allow you to do sampling. So portions of the building can be tested based on a weighted area on that. And there's 3 categories that they split it up to in order to get a representative idea of how the building is performing. And it's all areas directly under a roof have to be tested. All areas that have an entrance, exposed floor, or are below grade have to be tested. And then 25% of the remaining space of the above grade walls have to be tested. So if you don't want to do a whole building test, you can do some sampling on your building, and it might be a little bit easier, bite-sized chunks to look at to do that, but it also might take more time to do. But at least Boulder is giving you options to do sampling. And then they also break it out into dwelling units. So dwelling units are a different sampling protocol. So if you're testing these dwelling units, they actually have a different leakage rate. So that leakage rate before was 0.04 CFM per the code. That also follows Denver. But for dwelling units, that leakage rate is actually lower. It's 0.25 CFM per square foot. And it follows a different testing protocol. Instead of testing at 70 pascals, you're testing at 50 pascals. For those of you that don't know what that means, basically there's a commercial testing protocol and a residential testing protocol. This in Boulder for dwelling units follows more closely to the residential testing protocol. And they also let you sample in dwelling units. You have to sample at least 20% of the dwelling units in Boulder. Another item under the HVAC, if we all enjoy these operable windows and these overhead doors that we see like on the picture, we're going out to a restaurant and whatnot. Sometimes these are cargo doors, sometimes these are like accordion style doors, loading dock doors. All of those items fall into this category of overhead door HVAC shutoff. And that's saying that all the HVAC systems, whether it's heating, cooling, or humidity has to turn off in that zone when that overhead door is open to 25% or more. So you can see in the photo, that looks to be about 50%. So all the HVAC associated with that zone would be turned off because it's opened over 25%. Now, operable wall or roof openings, so this would be maybe an attic hatch or something like that. You don't necessarily always have HVAC in that areas, but if you have an operable wall or operable opening, the HVAC has to be set back when those are open. So within 5 minutes of opening those, it needs to be set back to 55 degrees for heating or 90 degrees for cooling. Jim, I'll turn it over to you to talk about electrical in Boulder.
All right, thanks, Kevin. So we had talked about solar readiness in Denver and how Denver did not require you to upsize the bus to accept the solar input. Boulder has taken a different stance. So you can see by the little table right there that they are requiring you to go with amps per square foot and include that in the size of the busing in your building so that your building is truly solar ready. So you'll have to have pathways, you'll have to have circuit breaker space ready to make it solar ready. And by the way, your circuit breaker space needs to be at the opposite end of the utility feed. So you're feeding, if you have a bus, you're feeding utility feed on one end and the PV array on the other. So Boulder is actually accounting for the amperage required that will be provided by the PV array, which is a pretty cool approach, I think. Next slide, yeah. Boulder added C405.1.1, which requires 90% of permanently installed luminaires to have lamps with an efficacy of not less than 65 lumens per watt and fixtures with an efficacy of not less than 45 lumens per watt. That requirement is exactly the same as the wording in the 2021 IECC. Denver just went with 65 lumens per watt for lamps and luminaires. So Denver's slightly different and a little more stringent. And then Boulder and Denver both added section C405.1.2 related to freezers and coolers complying with section C403.10.1 or .2, which requires fixtures and lamps to have an efficacy of 40 lumens per watt. So even in your walk-in freezers and coolers, they're requiring fixtures of a certain efficacy. Next slide, Kevin, please. Boulder, like Denver, added section C405.2.7 parking garage lighting. They both require lighting power to be reduced by 60%. And they're both more stringent than the IECC. So I think the amendments will change because many of the requirements in the 2021 IECC reflect what's in the Denver and Boulder requirements, but the Denver and Boulder will probably keep the 60% requirement in their amendments, okay? Next, there we go. So parking garage has to have automatic time switch shut off 60% when there's no activity. The lighting for eye adaptation at covered vehicle entrances shall be separately controlled to automatically reduce lighting power by at least 50% from sunset to sunrise. So when it's dark, you don't need that eye adaptation. And then the power to luminaires within 20 feet of the perimeter wall opening or penetration shall be automatically reduced by at least 50% response to daylight. Again, this is in the 2021 IECC. The last two parking garages I've worked on that I've been part of the design team, our lighting power density has been 0.06 watts a square foot. So your payback on this is going to be a long time, but at least we're saving some energy. Next, Kevin. The city of Boulder changed all but one of the lighting power densities in table C405.3.1. That's the interior lighting power allowances for building area method. So the the lighting power densities in the City of Boulder 2020 Energy Conservation Code is considerably more stringent than the 2021 IECC or the 2018 IECC. So it's going to be more difficult, for example, in the additional energy efficiencies. One of the things you're able to do is to increase your lighting power density, be 10% better than code. In Boulder, that's going to be more difficult than it is in other jurisdictions because their lighting power densities are considerably more stringent than the IECC. Boulder also amended Note C to Table C 405.3.2.1, allowing the exclusion of dwelling units where the requirements of C 405.1.1 are met, but Denver completely eliminated Note C. So if you're designing a multifamily project in Denver, make sure that you realize that Note C has been eliminated in Denver and the residential area will have to be included in your comm check. And Boulder amended the values to Table C 405.3.2 interior lighting power allowances space by space method. So adopting or exceeding the lighting power densities included in the 2021 IECC. So in the whole building method and the space by space method, Boulder has amended those lighting power densities to be more stringent. Next. The City of Boulder changed C 405.4 from exterior lighting power requirements to lighting for plant growth and maintenance. So both Denver and Boulder address lighting for plant growth and maintenance. Interestingly, the 2021 IECC does not have this section in it yet, but with the number of states that are adopting marijuana laws, I would expect to see it included in an energy code soon. The only difference between Denver's code and Boulder's code related to this is that Denver outlined 3 paths to achieve this and Boulder did not. However, by changing C 405.4, it thereby changed all the section numbering following C 405.4 in the Boulder Energy Conservation Code. So again, there's going to be a little bit confusion as you go from jurisdiction to jurisdiction exactly what the numbering or the name of the code is. Next, Kevin. The City of Boulder also inserted EV charging requirements into the Boulder Energy Conservation Code, and Table C 405.11.1 sets forth the requirements for the Group R. So greater than 25% of the spaces, number of EV reading spaces per dwelling unit is 10% of the spaces. Number of EV capable is 40% of the remaining spaces. Number of EVSE installed spaces is 5%. So in Denver, in a residential, the number of EV capable spaces is all of them. In Boulder, it's just 40%. So that's a considerable difference from Denver. Next, Kevin. So 405.11.2 sets forth the requirements for Group A, B, E, I, M, and S2 occupancies, which is your commercial office buildings. Greater than 25 spaces, it's 10% of the spaces EV ready. 10% of EV capable would be 10% also, and then EVSE installed would be 5% of the spaces. Okay, Kevin?
And then one last thing for City of Boulder on their amendments, they added a new section for commissioning, and it's the section under commissioning that they added is a energy use monitoring plan. And this is to be part of the operations and maintenance manual and must be provided as a written description of what meter data is collected, how the metering data is collected and stored, and how the data can be accessed for analysis. So this is part of the commissioning requirement now on that commissioning report. That section needs to be included. All right, so it looks like we got about 15 minutes left. So we got one more HJ, and that's the City of Fort Collins. We'll go through those amendments and then we'll open it up for questions. These are the items that we'll talk about in Fort Collins. Some definitions, more EV, more envelope, you know, it seems to be a reoccurring theme here. So definitions, they've called out 3 specific definitions in the Fort Collins amendments. And these are important because there are exceptions for buildings using electric heat or buildings not using electric heat. So they define electric heat as the primary indoor heat source that is electric. Ground source heat pumps is not considered to be electric heat for the City of Fort Collins. Non-electric heat is where the primary heat source is gas or a ground source heat pump without supplementary electric resistant heat, so without electric backup heat. So these are going to be important. So if you are using electric heat, so that based on that definition at 1.5 watts per square foot, you have to follow this table in the Fort Collins column. So again, 2018 is what is compared against the Fort Collins. So if you are using electric heat, you have to follow these items over here in Fort Collins. If you're not using electric heat, you can follow the 2018 column. So you'll see that that definition became important, and you'll also see that, oops, sorry, some of these items turned red over here to show that they have changed requirements. The City of Fort Collins also has created mandatory sections that you have to follow now, which are the above grade wall sections and the slab on grade perimeter insulation that is now mandatory. Also mandatory envelope leakage, mandatory testing. So just like Denver and Boulder, so I always have to think about which one I'm talking about. Fort Collins is requiring testing following the same standard at ASTM E779. Fort Collins has also given you an option to follow one of these other standards. So they've created their own testing protocol for commercial buildings and their own building code protocol for multifamily buildings testing. So you can use any one of these protocols to do your envelope testing in Fort Collins. I will point out that the ASTM standard, the passing rate, if you recall, for Denver was 0.40 CFM per square foot of envelope. If you look at the commercial building protocol for Fort Collins, that says testing passing is 0.25. If you look at the multifamily testing protocol, that says passing is 0.30. So even though you have options to follow or to pick from in Fort Collins, you have different passing requirements based on the protocol you're doing. We'll talk about confusing. That's why we're going through all the different AHJ's amendments right now, but they give you more ability and flexibility in your testing. So again, testing to the same Pascal passing limit. We already talked about that. The one thing I want to point out here is the asterisk. If you're following the 0.25 CFM passing rate, a diagnostic evaluation still needs to be conducted if you don't, if you're over that, if you're following that particular protocol, along with a visual inspection needs to be done. Then repairs need to be made, and it has to be retested. So that's an addition to anything that we've heard so far, that usually you just have to fix or address those items, say what you addressed, and then submit that to the owner and building official. In Fort Collins, you actually have to do a retest and then submit to your report to the building owner and the building official. They don't want to see that report if it's failed until it's actually been repairs have been done and a retest has been conducted as well. In the commissioning realm for Fort Collins, they are no longer looking at the BTU per hour of energy usage on your systems in order to trigger commissioning to happen. They do it based straight on square footage. So if your building's over 15,000 square feet, then you need to have commissioning performed. In addition, they've modified what tasks are considered to be commissioning in Fort Collins. The items listed in black are items by the IECC's definition. So you can see two of those things down at the bottom. The testing, adjusting, and balancing, also known as TAB, has been eliminated from Fort Collins commissioning scope. And then also the commissioning compliance checklist that your commissioning authority would have to fill out and send to the building official is also not required as part of the Fort Collins commissioning. They did add two other things, which are the items in red, which they have to do an OPR review, which is owner's project requirements, and a BOD review, which is a basis of design review. They also have to do installation checks. So believe it or not, the IECC does not require commissioning authority to do installation checks on the equipment, only functional testing. So Fort Collins took that a step further and says that you do have to do installation checks. Fort Collins also has made some changes to what systems need to be commissioned. The IECC items are listed in black. Everything else listed on the screen are additions to the IECC that Fort Collins has added. So they want to commission the envelope. So we saw that in Denver. We did not see that in Boulder. Shade controls, we have not seen that anywhere yet. Renewable energy sources have to be commissioned. We have not seen that anywhere in the presentation yet. Background sound levels, and then cooling tower water use has to be commissioned. So some added items if you're going to be commissioning in Fort Collins. Jim, I'll turn it over to you for electrical side.
Okay, so Fort Collins does have electrical vehicle ready requirements. It's 5% of the spaces, but it's an empty 3/4 inch conduit for a 50 amp circuit. However, in Fort Collins, it has to come from a panel with breaker space and so on in it. So in Fort Collins, you will have to build out the electrical infrastructure to provide EV power to 5% of the spaces in the city of Fort Collins. Next, Kev. The city of Fort Collins amended the 2018 IECC. They added corridors and enclosed stairwells and so on to C405.2.1. C405.2.4 specific applications control has been amended to require hotel rooms to automatically switch off. There's quite a few requirements in there about temperature setback and that kind of stuff. I would highly recommend you looking at that. And then C405.2.6.1, they simplified that section to just say shut it off within 30 minutes of sunrise. Next, Kev. 2.6.3, lighting setback is amended so that the total wattage of the control lighting is automatically reduced by 50%, up from 30%, from not later than 1 hour after business to not earlier than 1 hour before business opening. The IECC's got all kinds of language in there about from not later than midnight to 6 a.m. and not later than 1 hour after business closing and so on. Fort Collins just simplified it and said 1 hour after closing, shut it off, and 1 hour before opening, you can turn them back on. Okay, next. City of Fort Collins added section C405.10. This section is actually something you really need to watch. It's a section of metering, and it's basically taken out of ASHRAE 90.1. So the city of Fort Collins took the metering requirements in ASHRAE 90.1, moved it into the IECC so that anything over 600 amps is going to have the loads identified in section C 405 10.1 through 10.5 submetered, and that's in group U occupancy. So next, Kev. So HVAC loads, lighting loads, plug loads, process loads, and miscellaneous loads will all have to be metered separately, and that's going to cost you some money. I mean, that's your one line is going to have to be built in such a way that your HVAC loads are fed separately from your lighting loads, and that's separate from your plug loads. So your one lines and your panels and that kind of stuff in Fort Collins are going to be more expensive than you would see in other jurisdictions. We did a job in Grand Junction where we actually had to plug load to meter at the circuit breaker load to meet the metering requirements, and that's very expensive, and it creates a horrible amount of data. So your one line, you're just going to have more panels than you would normally have. So just be prepared for that in the city of Fort Collins, because you've got to meet the ASHRAE 90.1 metering requirements. Next.
And Jim, I'll add, remember in Boulder, they wanted to know how to access all that metered data as part of their commissioning plan. So I would imagine Fort Collins would go there next.
Yes, absolutely.
So that's it for the presentation. I know there's a lot of info that we squeezed in there, but it's very important to know the differences and caveats between the different AHJs. Granted, we only covered 3, but hopefully today you saw a kind of a sneak peek at how different and sometimes similar the different AHJs amendments are. But we'll turn it back over to Erica and open it up for questions.
Thanks, Kevin and Jim. That was great. It was definitely a lot of information. So we'll be posting the PDF of the presentation to the Google Drive for you all to refer back to. We do, for this presentation, if you are interested in, if you're from a jurisdiction and are interested in incorporating some of these amendments into your codes, feel free to shoot me an email, and we offer free technical assistance for jurisdictions. So with that, let's head over to some Q&A. Again, if you'd like to raise your hand, I can go ahead and unmute you and you can ask the presenters directly. That first question for you guys is, for more stringent lighting density requirements, does Boulder have a custom or modified ComCheck option?
Boy, Kevin, I don't have any idea.
Sure. So I know, I don't know about Boulder, but I do know that Denver does. Denver went ahead and has an option as a drop down to select Denver amendments for ComCheck. I do not know if Boulder has done the same.
I did look, I did a little bit of Googling, and I did find that some things are recorded on an interior lighting compliance form, and exterior lighting compliance is through IECC potentially. That may have changed, but I'm not seeing anything straightforward about a separate option for ComCheck and Boulder. Okay, so next question. Has there been any pushback from owners or landlords on increased cost?
Jim,
Well,
you want to talk about that, since EV seems to be a big topic there?
Yeah, I can feel that, you know, it's interesting. Yes, so owners, I mean, it's hard to make multifamily projects pencil out under many circumstances. And if you're adding, you know, if you've got a large high-rise multifamily project and you've got 450 spaces and you're adding $750,000 to the cost to the bottom line just for that one Denver amendment, that's a tough pill to swallow. So if you're a developer, you may be looking in other jurisdictions. I was working on a project in Greenwood Village, and Greenwood Village went the other way. They eliminated section C406 when they amended the when they adopted the IECC of 2015. So different jurisdictions are taking different approaches to either attract business or not. I applaud Denver for taking the steps that they're taking, because I think it's crucial, but yes, it does make it hard to pencil out for multifamily and office as far as that goes in Denver.
Right, and I'll just add to that. All of these AHJs, that we talked about today, and even the ones we didn't, have sustainability goals that they're trying to hit. And that's the whole point of these amendments that they're doing, is that they're trying to get to those goals. And inherently, there could be some more upfront costs. However, it's going to be better for the long run in terms of energy consumption. So yes, we'll get some pushback on developers and landlords that the upfront cost is going to be more expensive. But in general, we'll see a better, more reduction in carbon emissions, which is a lot of these AHJ's goals.
Great, thanks. Thanks, Jim and Kevin. We do have one more. Fort Collins appears to have made envelope requirements more stringent for electric heating. Or do they have any goals for electrification? And if so, how does this mesh with that?
Sure, yeah, you're reading the slide correctly. I don't know off the top of my head if they're going to go for an electrification plan. I know the city and county of Denver currently is looking at an electrification plan, but the city of Fort Collins, I'm not sure, but that is correct. For electric heating, there are more stringent requirements for envelope.
All right, I think that's all the questions that we have. Jim, Kevin, and I will stay on the line for another minute if there is anything else that comes up. But otherwise, thank you both to both of our presenters today, and thank you to everyone for attending. And we'll see you next week for residential updates to 2021.
I'll say while we're on the line here, if anybody wants to hang out and we'll have chats, but we did have somebody comment that if a certain jurisdiction starts to adopt the 2021 IECC, remember all of these are based on the 2018 IECC, it'd be interesting to see how many of these amendments are already part of the 2021 baseline IECC. So someone did comment on that, and I found that to be very interesting as well. The city and county of Denver has a very rigorous input process that they're going to be adopting and amending 2021 coming up, and a lot of public input can be had on that. So be sure to get involved if you're want to have your voice heard on these amendments. There are opportunities to do that.